right, so we're recording. And this is really just, this is pretty laid back. I got some questions for you guys, but really I just like to kind of have a conversation and, figure out how your guys' brains work. So myself and other people can learn from you guys and hopefully emulate it to save the world,
We're trying to do that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad people like you guys exist. So what's going on, man? Like, Brian, I guess we can start with you since you're the full fellow, you're kind of the head honcho here. What's the update with like you and the Maijuna work and all that? I know you're working on your doctorate. Has that came through yet?
Yeah, so on Wednesday I'll defend it. So on Wednesday I'm either going to be a doctor or not a doctor.
Oh man.
Find out. I'll either be celebrating or mourning.
Come on.
Wednesday like 4:01. No, it's gonna be good. So I've been working on my dissertation for the last year or so, along with a number of other different kind of side projects. Where the work's at right now, we've had to stop and pause all research in Peru, I guess, not even just Maijuna lands, since the pandemic started. But we're still hoping to keep putting in grants and things like that for future work. But it's hard to know when we'll be able to go back down there and when a vaccine will be developed. So we're not really, ethically, we don't think it's really right to go back down there until a vaccine is developed. So so right now I'm just working on my research from Washington and not really, I have no plans in the immediate future to go back to the field, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's tough. It seems like everything's been, derailed. And I know that creates a lot of conservation issues. I'm sure the Maijuna, at least from what I understand about the Esaeja and a couple other kind of tribes down there, they're not doing so well currently with the COVID thing. It seems that they're getting hit a little worse off than a lot of people, being so disconnected from medical care and, kind of all the modern assets that we have. Know anything about that?
Yeah, I think it's tough, especially because, and another big issue, like you said, is medical care, but also lack of communication. It's so hard to get information to and from the communities, and so that, we know what's going on, and if aid is required, that it can be sent down there. But also the other way, so that they have an understanding of how the rest of the world is doing with the pandemic and how that's going to affect them. And, it's hard when, you come from a completely different background and completely different knowledge system to be thrown into this situation where, your safety is no longer dependent on just yourself and your own practices, really. And Indigenous groups, it's challenging because there is like especially in the Maijuna communities, there's a really strong social aspect, For us, it's like, the CDC says, don't talk to your neighbors. And we're like, okay, I don't talk to my neighbors anyway.
Right.
But, but that's not really, it doesn't really work like that in a system where, for instance, food is shared amongst different families that live in the same area. And, everybody's kind of working towards a common goal and objective. And I imagine it's very difficult to, proceed with life as normal without having any contact with markets and things like that when, that's the system that you've depended on and you have no information coming in about what you should be doing. And, it's challenging. And I think that, if somebody does get sick, then the lack of access to medical care is really the driver of,
Right.
But I mean, at this point, it's loss of entire communities in some areas.
Is that what you guys are seeing with the Maijuna?
Recently, so there's been mixed news. So until recently, we had been talking to the Maijuna and told them kind of that, and right as the pandemic started, it was kind of like don't let anybody into the community, anybody out. But as I said, that's challenging. It's not like, you have any notice or anything like that of suddenly, suddenly there's a pandemic and suddenly now you can't leave your community, but people need medicine, they need gasoline, they need oil.
Yeah.
They need sugar, they need fishing hooks. you can't really just switch to a 100% subsistence society without any warning.
Yeah.
So there was a huge, a huge rush to kind of stop people from going in and out, but also a huge dependence where, time was limited on what you could do with the resources that you have. And especially in Peru, there's kind of this mindset of like, living day to day instead of, having like nobody's got like a year supply of fishing hooks sitting around. It's like, so our first priority was to kind of get kind of like this larger aid package down to the Maijuna communities that included things like medicine and included things like gasoline and fishing hooks and everything that they would need from a market so that they didn't have to go. But there were a lot of issues getting materials out of Iquitos because Iquitos was, turning into this virus epicenter when the pandemic started. And they weren't letting people in or out until you got tested, but they didn't have any tests. And so nobody was going in or out of Iquitos. And so our aid packages kind of couldn't get through either. But eventually, more recently, we were able to get that aid to the families. And they were doing well. And most recent news, and I just heard this the other day, most recent news is that a couple people went out to a testing boat to get tested for the virus, and some of them came back positive, I think. But
for the Maijuna?
Yeah.
Wow.
But so as far as we know, nobody's died, for instance. Nobody's had a severe illness so far, but it's same as anywhere. It's just a matter of time until the virus spreads down there. So we're hoping that, they have the information that they need, I hope, and now they have the materials that they need. But like I said, it's hard to get information. It's it's so sporadic. What you hear and when you hear it and who it's from. It could be second sources, third sources that you hear from.
Well, that's better news than I've heard about, other tribes like the Esaeja. And then there's another one, the Menene, I believe, or something like that out of Colombia. There's a lot of people dying. A lot of the elders are dying off. So it's, good that the Maijuna are kind of, hopefully they never reach that part of the curve, but sounds like they're doing okay so far. So I'm glad to hear that. Before we get ahead of ourselves, could you guys give your little introduction to yourselves?
Go, Fio. I've been talking.
Okay. Hi, I'm Fio. So I also work in Loreto. For one part of my, for my thesis, I work with this indigenous community in the border of Peru and Brazil. Just what I was hearing when you were saying, Brian, I think one big part of why the Maijuna were not affected as fast as many other these indigenous communities in Iquitos is because the regional government didn't bring any help to them. They were, so the regional government of Loreto were in this big boat bringing food supplies to all these indigenous communities, and they didn't realize that the people that were sharing the food with these communities had COVID. So they were spreading the food with the disease. So that's how some of these communities got infected. I don't know anything about the community that I work with for part of my dissertation, but I will reach out to ask Mark about that. I don't think he knows much about that either. So I work in Loreto. I work with wild meat consumption. For this past summer, I work in Iquitos, getting to know more about what people are eating there, more regarding wild meat consumption. So while you were talking about that people buy food every day, they are not used to, or they don't no están como que for their every, how can I say this in English? Maybe I can say it in Spanish and you can just say it in English. Brian? Yeah, como para día a día. Solo compran su comida para el día a día.
Yeah, you just do your daily shopping and that's how you live, and that's the lifestyle.
Yeah, so yeah, that's how I see that in my interviews. So the need for them to go to the markets every single day, even if they are in the city. We're not talking about the Maijuna that live so far away from the city, but even then, that they're so close to the markets, they need to go. And so I've been here working on the data that I have for my thesis, but also at the same time worry about all those like hundreds of people that I interview, because for this last part of my dissertation, I did interview a lot of households throughout the whole Iquitos. And Brian was saying, like Iquitos was a huge focus for the coronavirus when this started, like around March in Peru. And so it was like a complete chaos there. But now I'm working on my data, finishing on that, and then starting writing for that last chapter of my dissertation, and just basically focusing on that.
Oh, that's really cool. Congratulations on hopefully finishing everything up. You know, I read that you're a PhD candidate as well, so that's good. We need more doctors on the team. So it's really interesting. Like you said, the shopping that they do there is day to day. And I spent a little bit of time in Iquitos, and I kind of noticed that, you know, anyone in the States, at least growing up the way I grew up, would not really understand the way that they live there, where everything is so day to day and a lot more social, where we can kind of barricade ourselves in our house for a month or two, and it sucks, but it's possible. But there, you know, I think there's probably a lack of freezers and a lack of the ability to even do that. So like you guys were saying, I mean, that could be contributing to kind of why Iquitos became such a, you know, hotspot. And then I believe, Brian, you were saying they wouldn't let anybody in or out. So what's the story with that? Was it police barricades or military there?
Well, there's a Navy base in the city of Iquitos.
Ah.
So there's a large kind of military presence along with the normal police presence, which is, you know, the police presence in Peru is also higher than we have in the States, for example. But yeah, essentially they just stopped traffic to and from the rivers. And when you think about the city of Iquitos, which is kind of like this, they call it like this island city, right, where there's no roads in or out. You know, any materials have to come in by boat. You know, Fio's talking about these, you know, all the citizens of the city really are going shopping every day in these massive markets that cover miles. And all of these goods are being traded, but those goods are coming in daily from the river. And they're coming from producing communities that are like the Maijuna, for example, where they're extracting fruit and non-timber forest products, they're extracting game meat. And those things get sent to the city of Iquitos, where now you've got, you know, no flow of goods coming in and out of the city. And you've got this shutdown of this market system where people can no longer have access to those goods that they need every single day. And so, you know, I imagine you just get chaos, and you know, you've got the classic case of, you know, lack of understanding and lack of information that we even have in the States, but mixed in with this lack of food security and lack of, you know, knowledge of where your next meal is going to come from, because like you said, they don't have refrigerators, they don't have freezers and things necessarily. And so you've got this, it's a nasty situation.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, so something I hadn't even considered, you're saying the Maijuna are, you know, selling a lot of products in Iquitos. So not only is, I guess, their economy is also halted, whatever economy they have and trading they do, I would imagine most of their money comes from either some kind of ecotourism or, right, selling things in local towns, which has been shut down. So now they're not only lacking in, well, you know, they're not only getting sick, but they also don't have any income coming in. So it is like a total stagnant situation. It's really scary, you know, because it seems like any kind of tribe like that that lives not necessarily in congruency with society, they seem to, everything kind of floats downriver to them and affects them more. When one might assume that they would be more resilient because of their lifestyle, I guess because of the modern influences that become even more fragile. You know, Would you say there's truth to that?
In some cases, yeah. As you say, for example, the Maijuna are, they receive a lot of sustainable income from ecotourism. And, when you think about tourism right now, the first question is, when will ecotourism start again in Peru? And the second question is, when should ecotourism start again in Peru? So, for instance, say, the Peruvian government says all clear, foreigners can come back. Is that a good decision for the Maijuna to accept people back in their communities and foreigners?
But there is no tourism open.
Yeah.
If all the travel that it's allowed in Peru, it's only necessary. Even for people traveling within the country, you can only go to somewhere if you really need to get to the place. There is no tourism, nothing for fun. It's all closed until the end of the year. So that's really gonna put a huge dent into the economy that it's already in distress in many of these indigenous communities that really rely on ecotourism or sending their aguaje to the city of Iquitos. So this is really big issue for those parts of Peru that really don't get much help from the government. And yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, it makes you, we're lucky to be in the States for this whole thing, because while it's bad here in some ways and people are sick, it's an entirely different, I feel very safe. If I don't get sick directly, I know that nothing can happen to me. I'm not going to starve. So it is crazy to think of these communities that are, much more dependent on, like you said, it's a day-to-day lifestyle. Anyway, yeah, the pandemic thing has really changed, the theme of all these conversations and kind of what they were meant to be about, and then kind of what's the biggest pressing issue now. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about what you guys do, pandemic aside. Fio, I know you mentioned that you work with, I guess the sustainability of wild game meats, and I guess how that plays into the Loreto region and all that. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So for one big part of my dissertation, I focus on wild meat consumption. It's kind of similar to what Brian does in that part. And I work with this indigenous community, which is very far away from Iquitos. You have to take a boat for 4 days just to get to the community. And so I went there and I worked with them, worked mostly with hunters, trying to know how they were hunting, where they were going hunting, if they were sending some of these meat to the city, and just to learn more about them, more about that and their hunting techniques, to know if that it's in a way sustainable, using a model that kind of shows an extinction envelope or an area where the animals that they are hunting might be depleted. So that's one part of my dissertation. And then for the last part of my dissertation, because I saw this big problem of these indigenous communities, not just hunting for their subsistence, but also sending all this meat to the city. Because you know that in Peru, we have subsistence hunting, and subsistence hunting, it's legal, but bushmeat hunting, it's illegal. So all indigenous communities, they can hunt only for the subsistence. If they sell some of this meat, that's illegal. They need some sort of permits, or they need some sort of management plan. So there are very few of these communities that have management plans. So I remember in one of my last trips to this indigenous community, which is Nueva Esperanza, we were going to Iquitos with this big boat, and we just noticed this weird smell in the boat. So when we go to these control points in Brazil, they like to check your boat. They like to see that everything is okay, because there is a lot of drug trafficking in the three frontiers, like Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. So they always like to check the boats. And when they call us 30 minutes later, they had taken some of these wooden, como tablas. I don't know how to say that. Wooden what?
Boards.
Boards. And there was all this meat. underneath the boat. I don't know if I told you this, Brian, but there's like a lot of meat. There's like tapir, there's a lot of paca meat. And we were like so stunned, like this was traveling with us. And it was the boat that we have hired. And we asked people from the community, where's all this meat going? And they were like, well, we are sending that to Iquitos, to the markets. And so we realized that they were smuggling meat to there. And so this was like a common thing. Like they would do this once per month. And so we started realizing that this is really a big issue in Iquitos, which is the biggest Amazonian city in the whole Peru. And so Iquitos has one of these like big wild meat markets in Belén. I don't know, I'm sure you have been there, Brian, where people just like sell meat and like right there, like even though it's legal to sell wild meat, and policemen go and check them selling wild meat, they still keep on doing that. Nobody does anything. So we had this big question about like how much wild meat are people in the city eating, right? So then we started like kind of like creating this like sampling method. And this past summer I went there to do a lot of interviews, and so just to get a grasp of how much wild meat are people eating and if they're really eating that much, because really there is no like, there's only one or two different articles that have been published a long time ago with some information from that, only referring to markets, not to people's households. So yeah, so that's what I'm focusing now. And I have pretty exciting results that people are in fact eating a lot of it. So yeah. But yeah, that's what I'm working right now. So now during the pandemic, nobody's selling wild meat that I know of in the markets. But I had a conversation yesterday with my friend Diana, who is also my assistant, and she told me that she noticed that everything was starting to get back to their normality in Belén and all these markets. So I'm sure this wild meat is gonna come back. I don't know how soon, but it's getting back there.
That's really interesting. So you wonder if the pandemic gave some of the local populations of animals maybe a little chance to recover anyway, you know, or took some stress off of them. I guess it's hard to know, but what kind of animals do people mainly eat? What are the big ones? They're the, you know, I guess the ones that sell for the most money.
So the from my interviews, like I feel like people prefer to eat paca and paca. Yeah, it's a big rodent.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and the meat is very tasty. I've never tried it. I'm sure Brian has tried that and many other different animals. But
is it good, Brian?
Oh, it's good.
I'm sure he has. Yeah.
Don't tell us that. Now everyone's gonna want to eat it.
Well, unfortunately, it's like there are two different realities. When you are in the city, you have the chance to either buy it or not buy it. So it really depends on you. But when you are working with an indigenous community and they put the plate with paca meat in front of you, if you refuse to eat it, that's going to be disrespectful. And you want to have these strong bonds between you and the community members. So the fact that you're saying, no, I don't want to eat that, that can really like hinder all that progress that you have made. So I'm sure that's why Brian has eaten paca, satamak, and all these different animals. But yeah, even though that I've worked a long time in the Amazon, I used to work in this NGO, but everybody in the NGO were like vegan. So every time that we'll go to a community that I work with, they would always know that they were vegan. So we were all like kind of vegans, and nobody ever offered us anything. It was like everything prepared with like coconut ceviche, like, so I was like safe in that moment, but yeah. So paca, color peccary, and also caiman. Those are the three big ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
So all bigger animals, big mammals. It sounds like. Oh, I guess you said what was the last one?
a caiman lagarto, they don't, this is weird because this animal hasn't been considered in many of the articles that we have seen research on. It's what's the scientific name for that, Brian?
I think it's just crocodilus, or the spectacled caiman, but there's the black caiman as well.
Oh, caiman. Oh, I got you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are the three big ones in there. And I feel like, yeah. And the prices of all of them, it's paca.
That's what everybody wants is paca, huh?
That's what everybody wants, yeah.
So that's really interesting. So Brian, I know this kind of leads into your line of work or study of, like, I guess you kind of do more so in measuring mammal species and in the area. Do you find there's a big impact on the sustenance hunting end, or do you think it's more related to the commercial end of hunting and selling the meat? What have your results been?
Yeah, so I kind of examine hunting from, instead of the consumer side, from the producer side. So Fio has like a little elements of both, but I'm just kind of on the producing side where, you know, these indigenous communities are out hunting and they are consuming a good portion of the meat. They're gifting a good portion of the meat to their neighbors and friends and family, but they're also selling a good portion of the meat. So what I found is that in general, for instance, the Maijuna, for example, and the Maijuna, you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt because the Maijuna live at the southern end of this vast protected area. And that protected area is likely just pumping animals south into this river basin where the Maijuna hunt most frequently. And so there's only, I would say now, there's probably between 20 and 25 active hunters in Sukasari, in the Maijuna community, and that's very, very low. So it's very likely that any hunting that they're doing is sustainable just because there's not enough of them to kind of overwhelm this source population that's pumping animals south into the river basin. So that's good news. But what I found in general is that hunters actually sell about 58% of the meat that they harvest. And not a lot of those sales are to market necessarily. So they'll sell it also within the community. They'll sell it to nearby communities along the river where they have family and friends. Or they'll sell it to the regional market, which gets sold to a middleman, and that middleman takes the meat to Iquitos. I've found that hunters definitely prefer to hunt the paca and the collared peccary, along with the red brocket deer and the tapir and the white-lipped peccary, but by far they preferred the paca and the collared peccary. Those two species also sold for the highest price because, like Fio was saying, they taste the best. The other animals, like for instance, deer is a little bit tougher. It has like a slightly stronger flavor. And white-lipped peccary and tapir, while they also have nicer kind of red meats, what we would call red meats. It's kind of like a smelly meat, people will say. It has a really strong odor. Mm-hmm. And they're not really selling anything else. So they're hardly selling things like agoutis, which are smaller rodents. They're not really selling primates, anything that they would consider like a non-desirable game species. They're not selling, which is interesting. And so we've got this system where hunters are targeting these paca, for example. Let's take the paca. The paca is a rodent. Rodents have very large reproductive rates compared to some of the other large-bodied species. So the paca, we're talking, when I say large-bodied, the paca can get up to like 16 kilos. We're talking like a pretty big guinea pig, for example. Especially, yes, 16 kilos. And so, but this animal has a really high reproductive rate. And so the fact that that hunters are targeting them preferentially, because not only does the meat taste the best, it sells for the highest price. That has huge sustainability implications because hunters in Sukasari, for instance, some of them will tell you, why would I shoot a tapir? And then, because then I have to get it out of the river, I have to carry it, I've got to take the bones out, I've got to deal with this big animal that's going to sell for a lower price per kilo when I could just keep paddling along the river and shoot, 5 or 6 paca and get a higher price. It tastes better. I'm like, well, that's interesting because, traditionally is this mindset that hunters are going for the largest species because they get the largest kind of return for their hunting effort. Whereas now we're kind of seeing the shift where potentially, and Fio and I kind of have to compare our data in the coming years, potentially this kind of drive for paca meat, for example, in Iquitos, is also driving this shift in the market to these indigenous communities and changing their hunting preferences, and therefore influencing sustainability, but also how mammals are moving and changing their populations across the landscape.
That's really interesting. So, and I know everything is kind of still being studied, but do you think that the paca and maybe the collared peccary you think that's a better thing for everything else if that's what they're preferably hunting?
I think if they're shifting their consumption away from species like primates and tapirs, it's hard to say because overhunting of any species is going to cause negative impacts.
Right.
But I would say that they would likely cause fewer negative impacts than heavy hunting of primates and heavy hunting of larger bodied species like the tapir, which perform a lot of key ecosystem roles and services. But it really does have to be a balance, and so that's kind of a tricky question. If they hunt out all the pacas and collared peccaries, we're still going to see a shift in communities, for example.
Right, and then they're going to have only left the tapirs and primates to hunt, and then everything goes quickly down the drain.
Right.
How conservation aware do you think that the people are as a whole? Are they educated about? I mean, they've been hunting this land for forever, so I'm sure it's some kind of knowledge or tradition not to overhunt. But do you find that it's a theme among hunters?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question as well. One of the things that I study is hunter decision making and hunter kind of like motivations, I would say. In that, for instance, when a hunter is out in the forest and he comes across a group of animals, let's say a troop of monkeys, how does he decide whether he wants to shoot at the monkeys or not? And if he decides to shoot, how does he choose, for instance, which individual in the group that he wants to kill? And I find that that's interesting because traditionally, for example, the Maijuna, for instance, the woolly monkey was a traditional food for the Maijuna. It had a lot of cultural significance. Whereas they didn't hunt howler monkeys, just like many other indigenous groups, because they considered howler monkeys to be this kind of evil spirit, which if you stand next to them and hear them, you could totally understand why, where that idea comes from. But so these kinds of traditional beliefs traditionally kind of acted as like pseudo management plans, where some of these species that are really ecologically important, like the howler monkey and seed dispersal, or for instance the tapir, the Maijuna have a really interesting creation story about the tapir as well. These species in a lot of different areas are kind of protected by these hunting taboos. And so I was kind of interested in studying the Maijuna now and seeing how their decisions are impacted by their own personal beliefs and traditions. And so, for instance, now many hunters in the community will say things like, I don't hunt primates, or, I don't kill monkeys. And I say, oh, why don't you kill monkeys? And, I can think of one hunter that always used to say, I think they're going to be humans one day. I think they're going to grow up to humans. Another hunter calls monkeys his cousins. He's like, why would I shoot my cousins? And then Sukasori, hunters are what I would say are territorial, right? So each family has this like hunting zone, if you can imagine, throughout the landscape. And so that they really are like family territories. But when you combine this territoriality with this decision-making, what you get is that, for instance, if a whole family doesn't hunt primates, in their zone, there's essentially a primate refuge, right? Where species, these large-bodied monkeys can breed and live in this zone in the middle of the hunted area, and they can feed the population into the rest of the ecosystem where other hunters are actually killing primates. And so this heterogeneity in hunting pressure could actually contribute to sustainability.
Oh, that's really cool, man. That's great news.
That would be very cool to research, right?
to my dissertation.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But I think along with what you were saying is like, I remember reading Carla's thesis. So Carla is like she already defended her master thesis. She used to be in our lab. And so she studied traditional knowledge and all this traditional knowledge that the Maijuna had with all these different animals and their connection with the animals. And she talked about woolly monkeys. And so there's this whole story about woolly monkeys. But the gist of it is that woolly monkeys used to be human. So that's why they don't hunt woolly monkeys or these large monkeys, because they used to be humans, their ancestors. So it's pretty cool to hear that again. But yeah.
Yeah, it seems like, like you were saying, Brian, and also you feel that the traditional knowledge and belief systems serve as like a guidelines for conservation long before we had any kind of ecological understanding of the importance of species. And you wonder how rooted that ancient knowledge is in some form of early conservation practice, you know, and I'm sure there's wisdom there and a connection. When I was talking to Camilo, the artist, who's also an emerging fellow, who has lived with the Munene, they find that because of the traditional belief systems around a lot of the local birds in Colombia, those birds have been protected for a long time. But as the tribe and the ethnic peoples lose their grip and kind of lose their strength as a community, as people die off and young people move away, the birds start to become hunted and less valued. And it's really interesting that it seems like people need to have an emotional connection to the animals if we're going to protect them, which is why it's so important to keep on, not only to keep these communities strong, but to tell their stories to young people everywhere, and kind of create that emotional connection to these animals, as well as the scientific understanding of their importance. And I think like a good example of where we've seen that work is in the United States, how we don't have, you know, really traditional religious belief systems here, but we still have that emotional connection to like the bald eagle, for example. And without having made that the national bird, there's a good chance it would have become locally extinct because it was so threatened. But because of that emotional connection that we created, people really kind of went out of their way to make sure that the bird was protected. And now the numbers are, you know, much healthier and doing much better. So it's interesting to see, to compare the traditional knowledge to kind of our modern way of, you know, emotionally connecting to an animal, and seeing how that actually works in protecting species. Because the science doesn't seem to, though we know so many, you know, species are key for an area to be healthy, the science isn't always enough to convince people, you know, which is really interesting. So how did you guys come to work together? Brian, how did you come to kind of take on Fio as an emerging fellow?
Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, Fio. Yeah, so I mean, me and Fio are like, I mean, if we could be cousins, we would probably be cousins or something. We study like the same things. We study, you know, we're interested in the same ideas. We have the exact same kind of goals, I think. Exact same frustrations, I would say.
We read each other's minds at this point?
Maybe,
well,
I don't know.
maybe. Before I could tell when we would see each other in the lab meetings, but now I'm like, oh, what is Brian thinking?
Yeah, no, we're constantly, yeah, it's tough now. Obviously, you know, I don't want to talk about the pandemic anymore, but it's tough with the pandemic because, you know, it's, you know, universities used to be these like, I mean, they still are once they reopen, but, you know, these collaborative spaces where, you know, you run into people, you know, I'd run into Fio all the time, at least once or twice a week. And you end up throwing around ideas and hypotheses and you know, getting an idea of, you know, I would get an idea of what Fio was doing with her data, what the things that she was finding, and that sparks new ideas of things to test on my end, and, you know, collaborations and things like that. So, but I met Fio when I started at Mason in 2016 as a PhD student, and Fio, you started in 2015, right, Fio?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Fio, I met when I arrived. And so when I was first starting out, Fio was like like a nice mentor for me and teaching me the ropes of being a successful graduate student. And
Which
I
he
didn't know
didn't
that.
really need, okay? He was like, oh yeah, I'm done with this paper in this whole week. Yeah, people, it's easy.
He's a kid. But you know, to be honest, I didn't really know what I was doing when I started graduate school. I was like the worst. You know, I was good at doing my work, but besides that, like I didn't know what was going on. And I was living abroad at the time, so I kind of moved back to the United States, and then like, you know, 6 days later started a PhD program. And so, you know, I didn't have any friends. I didn't have any idea of what I wanted to study. And so Fio was already studying hunting in the Amazon, and obviously she's Peruvian, so she had a great grip on you know, the systems over there and what we currently study. So she was a good resource for me. And then, you know, as we go forward, I find out that we both love photography. We both love advocacy, and we kind of have the same kind of values and things like that. And we work well together. So, and we both teach. So it was nice to, you know, yeah, it seemed like our lives were connected.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, Brian always like, I feel like as a graduate student, like sometimes we feel stuck, and I don't think we have many people outside our program or our lab to talk about really all our struggles and like what can be my next step, because I don't understand. I don't think that my mom or my sister or my friend will like really understand what I'm working on. I tell them, they're like, yeah, cool, yeah, it sounds interesting, but that's
Animals,
it,
cool.
right? They cannot give me any feedback. But that's like, I feel like even though Brian is young, he's like very wise, and like we can always talk about like all these different things, and he's very smart too. Okay, I'm just like, so but no dejes que te suban los humos. Like, we'll be good. Yeah, but so it's really good to talk to someone about like all these like real life grad student struggles, like what can be next with my data, is this like going well? So yeah.
Sounds like you guys make a great team.
Yeah, we're good friends. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Brian, how did you end up ahead of Fio on the ACER Conservation Fellows list?
Oh, wait, what?
I don't really know.
Ahead of the, wait,
So,
I didn't understand the question.
As I understand it, Brian is a full conservation fellow, and Fio, you're an emerging fellow.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you actually trained Brian. So how did he pull that switch on you and get ahead?
Well, I think I owe this like fellowship to Brian. He's the one that like put me in like shared this like fellowship, how this was done, so I could apply. And I feel like he has all, like, you have worked before with John, right?
Mm.
So I'm sure like I'm guessing is that but yeah, but I feel like we mentor each other. It's not like I feel like it's like a reciprocate thing. So
right.
Yeah, we totally have different like areas of expertise, I would say.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, it's cool how your guys' work crosses over so well too. Like how Brian, it seems like you understand more from the native group's perspective of hunting, and then Fio understands what happens to that meat that is sold and how that, you know, impacts kind of the greater picture of conservation. It's cool how you guys kind of created this system where you can compare work and come out with kind of better results. So that's great that that's how it worked out. Brian, do you want to talk about the project that you were hoping to embark on next year?
Yeah, sure.
Top secret?
Yeah, no, I can talk about it. Yeah, so I mean, I'm graduating hopefully in 2 days, but we'll see. But so I was seeking kind of an interesting postdoc opportunity, and you know, I think my opinion, especially in our field in conservation or environmental science, or whatever you want to call it, is that science is really lent value by advocacy. And so personally, I think that, you know, there's this huge debate in the scientific community of whether scientists are supposed to be advocating or whether we're supposed to just shut our mouths and write our papers. But I think for instance, conservationists, I think we have a responsibility to advocate. And so for me, that's been a core part of how I approach my work. And I think that Fio as well, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so I was looking for kind of a different type of postdoc opportunity, where I was looking for something that was highly interdisciplinary, still scientifically rigorous, really interesting, but had a huge value in terms of advocacy and kind of this campaign of awareness. And so I would say the largest threat besides the pandemic facing the Maijuna right now is the construction of this highway that's going to cut through their ancestral territory and the protected area where they currently live. And again, that protected area really sustains their livelihoods and their food security and well-being. And so, you know, this highway has kind of been really like hush-hush in the past, where if you ask people from the government about it, they kind of said, oh, you know, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't know what you're talking about. But if you ask the Maijuna about it, they'll say, yes, the government's already been here, for instance, to scope out the route of the road. And I had been hearing about it, but one time towards the end of my stay in Peru, living with the Maijuna, I took a trip up with Mike Gilmore, actually our advisor as well. We were doing this super epic project where we went all the way up into the river basin, you know, several days up by boat, and then we were going to canoe all the way back down and do kind of like photography and video and interviews along the way back down to kind of create this piece of an autobiography of a Maijuna elder, which we're currently seeking funding for as well. But when we went all the way up into the middle of nowhere, and I'm talking like, you know, pristine rainforest, like for miles, we chanced across this huge trail in the forest that had been like, I mean, we're talking maybe 10 feet wide. You know, it was very obviously cleared, like of all trees, all vegetation. Several years ago, it started to come back. So we started asking questions like, what is this? Where did it come from? And the Maijuna said, well, the government actually sent people here to walk the length of the proposed highway and cut the trail where they were going to put it in, to like scope it out several years back. So even though they say like, we don't know what you're talking about, they're actively planning this construction. And now construction of the highway has started from Iquitos. And so we kind of realize that we're in this kind of critical situation here where time is limited to stop the construction of this highway, because it'll really result in the destruction of the Maijuna way of life, and all the animals in the particular area essentially will be put at risk. So this project I developed in collaboration with Mike Gilmore and John Cox and several other collaborators was to essentially walk the length of this proposed highway, this trail that had been cut all the way from the city of Iquitos to El Estrecho, which is on the border of Colombia, and to document the species that we saw along the way that would be affected by the construction of the road, but also the traditional knowledge and the belief systems that would be affected by the construction of the road, that are bound to the land, you know, that are linked to this biodiversity that's inherent in the area. With the idea of producing kind of like this visual story mapping component mixed with art exhibitions, you know, fine art and videography sales and things like that, to really kind of give a voice to these Maijuna elders who are, you know, who grew up here and who their livelihood is sustained by this area, while also kind of providing this, you know, this kind of all-encompassing survey to science as well about what the diversity and the richness of this area really entails in terms of what we call biocultural diversity.
And this proposed highway is running through protected Maijuna land, right?
That's right.
And wouldn't that's illegal technically on the government's side of things to cut through there and I guess somehow capitalize on using it? Technically,
the Maijuna are collaborative managers of this protected area. So technically, yes, they need to be consulted before the government puts in the highway. And we think that is why it's been so hush-hush, because they haven't consulted them. So if they were to say officially, like, we're building this highway, they would have to sit down at the table with the Maijuna Federation, for example. Right. But I think that my opinion is that if they kind of delay it long enough, they'll find some loophole or some reason why they can construct this highway without bringing the Maijuna to the table.
I mean, once that it's declared like a national, like that's the same thing that happened with the interoceanic. And once that they declare like a national, like something that it's of national importance to develop, or they would do it. Nobody can question it. When the interoceanic was being built, there were a lot of questions raised by actually one part of the government that they were questioning about, like, oh, are these like environmental studies like good enough for you to put this road? But once that it's declared like of national importance, nobody can question until it's done. And in this case, like it works. So even though the Maijuna have their title lands, if the government has a couple of years before deemed this area important for them to pass a road, then that kind of, it's like more important that the fact that there is indigenous land title there. It's like, okay, if we decided 5 years ago before we declared this your land, okay, we're gonna go with what we declared 5 years ago. Okay, we want to put the road here. So they do it. And it is really, it's unreal to know that they want to put another road cutting like pristine forests when we have like clear examples in Peru. We have two big examples. We have the Interoceanic Highway cutting Madre de Dios and connecting Peru to Brazil and to Bolivia. And then we also have the Iquitos Nauta road, which is another road in Loreto. And you can see that this brings a lot of social and environmental impacts like there. This is really the worst that can happen in this indigenous territory there.
So would this be the first, now you mentioned there was a road in Iquitos, Fio, which I did not know about. Would this be the first actual highway leaving Iquitos, connecting it to another kind of larger human dwelling?
Well, so Iquitos, as Brian was saying, is kind of an island. It doesn't, you cannot go anywhere by road. Right. So there is one big highway that I had the chance to go through when I was doing my interviews. And this big highway connects Iquitos, which is the center of Loreto, to all these different other smaller villages, which keep getting bigger and bigger because, I mean, they are connected to everything, right? So this new road will connect Iquitos to what? To where would it connect?
In Colombia.
In Colombia, yeah. So now we have a connection from Peru to Brazil and Bolivia, and now we will have a connection from Iquitos to Colombia. And you see, one of the big purposes of the government of like building these roads is because in Peru, there's this like big phrase, it's like carretera es progreso, or like, it's like building roads is like a progress or like development. Roads are a synonym of progress or development in Peru. So all these different communities want to have a road, but in this case, we have an indigenous community who doesn't want to have a road. And more importantly, when in Peru a couple of years ago with El Baguazo, now it's mandatory for these big developers to have the previous consult or consulta previa. So it means that they really should talk to the Maijuna, which besides having this as a title land, they are an indigenous community that live nearby this project. So it's unreal why they are trying to do this. And the regional government is really pushing for this road to be constructed. And already 2 big segments of the road have been constructed, but now we have the last part of the road, which it's supposed to be in the Maijuna title lands to be constructed. So I guess nobody understands why it's so important for them to put this road there. But
well, like you were saying before, Fio, how you were in that boat and there was all kinds of meat that they were trafficking. You know, you would imagine now if there's a highway running through this pristine jungle, how easy it would be, you know, for illegal hunting or logging or anything, because it kind of gives anybody access to, like, you know, untouched areas of the forest, which is scary.
But I mean, there will still be like control posts, like control points. Like, for example, this like interoceanic in Peru was built to increase the exportation of like products from Peru to Brazil, and to send produce from Peru to like these ships in Brazil, like to Africa and to Europe. Okay, but this is not happening. Like this is really there are only very few amount of these big trucks sending all these produce to Brazil. It is actually Brazil the one, or Bolivia, the ones that are beneficiating from this road.
Mm-hmm.
And also nobody can take timber, like, because once that it gets to the point, to the control point, they realize that if something is illegal, they just confiscate the whole thing.
Right.
So I don't see how they can like smuggle all these different things in an easy way if there are going to be all these policemen there controlling this area. So
Well, that's good that there is checks and balances, but it sounds like the best thing would be to not build the road in the first place, you know?
yeah, exactly.
So Brian, then your plan is to bring awareness and raise money, you know, to the Maijuna situation in hopes that they'll be able to create a legal barrier for the, you know, to stop the progression of this highway.
Yes, that's one. So we've got a couple different like audiences, right? And this project, along with a number of other efforts, there's also a documentary that was produced. And we've got a number of different audiences. So the first one is regional government offices. So as Fio said, a portion of the regional government is really pushing for this road construction, and it's a portion of the essentially the Department of Agriculture, because the road also comes with this, what they call a development corridor. Within 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers on either side of this highway will be zoned for development, which really means essentially like palm oil plantations and things like that. So it really is kind of like an agricultural endeavor. And as Fio said, it's supposed to be the trade of goods, agricultural goods, one would think, between other nations. And so actually the official stance of the departments of, I think, the environment and the Ministry of Culture are against the construction of the road. And they actually attended, for instance, the documentary film screening that was in Iquitos. And so there is some opportunity to engage in this kind of legal, I hate to use the word fight, but this legal fight against the road, not only using the power of the Maijuna Federation, but also of these kind of allies that they've recruited along the way. But the second audience is really a global audience, in that what I think many other regions are starting to realize, and I think Peru seems like every now and then it seems, they go backwards, but it seems like they're getting on the board of this boat of ecotourism, where these large tracts of pristine rainforest actually have more value intact than they do, fragmented by these highways and things like that, because they have a high value for tourism. And so if you look at a place like Madre de Dios, now you've got the interoceanic highway running through, into Puerto Maldonado, which you might have seen, Dylan, while you were down there. And so that's fragmenting the landscape. And then you've also got this really interesting, huge impacts of ecotourism, where people are paying like thousands and thousands of dollars to do things like see one jaguar along the river. And there are plenty, because people pay so much money to see them. And so, this idea of reaching out to this global audience to bring attention to this issue not only will, showcase, the importance of conserving people's culture and biodiversity, but also may showcase the importance of the area potentially for ecotourism and the economic value of the area being left intact, which, in conservation, our biggest challenge 100% of the time, I would say, is reconciling economics with conservation. Like how do you possibly reconcile those two things? And it's this constant back and forth, where if you want to be successful in conservation, you better be reaching into economics, because, on the government level, on the large organization level, that's what matters. And so right now the government of Peru is seeing dollar signs from the construction of this highway. They need to see dollar signs from the stopping the construction as well.
Right. So it's not even a battle so much as it's a popularity contest. look, this can make more money if it's protected, because I know those palm oil plantations those are no good, you know,
and like Fio was saying, they bring colonists. You know, colonists as in, you know, people that are new to the area, and those people are hunting, they're extracting non-timber resources, they're extracting timber resources, and all those things are getting sent to the city of Iquitos, where they're being sold, and some are sold illegally. Like, don't quote me on this, but Mike and I snuck into a lumber mill in Iquitos last year. I don't know if I told you this, Fio. And we acted like we were interviewing the foreman of the lumber mill, and you know, wanted to learn about his lumber industry, whatever. Mm-hmm. And he was very forthcoming, kind of like bragging almost about all this timber. And he very readily showed us these massive piles of huge tree trunks that he was like, oh, these are the illegal ones. That's why they're off to the side and not tagged. So if an inspector from Lima comes, like, we could get shut down for having these logs here. And we were kind of like, oh, where do these come from? And he was, you know, he kept saying things like, oh, well, you know, rural communities have to contract with us because that's how they make their money. And so we provide people livelihood by paying them for these logs, which is like, so,
it's the worst lie ever.
We were like, what? You know, but we were, you know, putting on this show. So we're like, oh yeah, you know, that work you do is so important. And I'm taking pictures in the whole 9 yards. But you could totally see that, you know, overall, I think studies have shown that deforestation around Iquitos is actually declining, but so much of it is also still illegal that's hard to say. So it's, you know, it was amazing to me, like Fio said, like, you know, game meat is one thing, and that it's easy to, you know, bring a paca into the market on your boat and sell it in the market. It's not so easy to ship a barge full of massive trees. We're talking ancient trees into the city, straight into a lumber mill, and nobody really cares.
But now that you're mentioning this reminds me. So the community that I work with, they have in their whole, like, they have like huge title land, but then inside the title land, they have an area where they can extract timber. So these big timber producers, and the biggest timber like extractor in the whole Loreto, his last name is Palomino, and he's like the best friend with everybody in the community that I work. So he will kind of contract or like give some money to these like people in the community. Okay, I'm gonna give you money for you to get fuel, for you to buy your boots, for you to buy your machete, for you to buy all the things that you need to extract timber. So you're gonna extract timber, you, like, I don't know, have to give me like 5 different big trees. And so once that they bring the timber there, so they get paid, but then this person tells you, okay, but now you have to pay me back for the boots, you have to pay me back for this, you have to pay me back for all of that.
Your food, so, you have to pay me for your chainsaw chains.
Exactly. So all their effort and all the impact they cause is for nothing, because it's really that money, that little money that it's left doesn't even allow them to buy stuff that they really need. So this is like the mentality that it's happening with these communities, and they still don't understand that they are being exploited. And they could do so much more instead of just spending 6 months or 4 months of their whole year inside the forest, like chopping down trees and hunting and thinking that they're going to have a good revenue, when in fact that is not really a good deal. It's a good deal for the person that is bringing all this money to them and it's selling the timber, but it's really not a good deal for the community.
I guess that provides, you know, the guy you mentioned who's giving out the chainsaws and stuff with some legal protection too, because he's not associated with cutting down the trees. They take the risk of harvesting and transporting, and then he gets them and he's able to put them away and kind of protect himself, while also keeping them stuck in a chain of working, I guess, because they owe him money. That's crazy. It's like the old coal mines, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, the community signed this piece of paper that says we gave them permission to have these logs, and suddenly it's legal timber.
Yeah. Oh, what a trick, huh? What kind of trees are they mainly going after? And then mahogany's like a you know, prize.
Like cedro.
Yes.
Cedro is a big one.
Cedro is big, and these massive cedar trees. Where we work is the lapuna tree is also huge. The kumala tree is another hardwood that's really
But
sought
Chihuahua
after.
is another good one too.
Which one?
Chihuahua, it's like these big tall trees where like macaws made their nest, like they're
Yeah.
hanging, and there are not many left, but if you find them.
Yeah, and then especially in Maijuna lands, they're also seeking a tree called the tornillo tree,
Oh yeah.
and the machimangua tree is sought after for timber as well.
Oh man, well we got to protect these forests, you know. We got people like you guys exist. You're very inspiring to the rest of us who want to kind of jump on board, you know. We can start wrapping this thing off. I'm sure you guys have other things to do with your day. Let me just take a look at my notes here. I know there's more. I'd like to get you guys, if this is, you know, something you can kind of word as short as possible, because we're going to work on making all these interviews into something that's kind of part of a greater project and kind of extracting bits from each one as like supporting, you know, other footage and stuff we get. Could both of you answer, what does conservation mean to you in as few words as possible? Feel free to take a second to think about that.
I guess for me, I would say that conservation means sustainability, and in that conservation means the protection of natural resources because of their inherent value, but also for future use. And so I would say that conservation, for instance, for me is different than preservation, because I think that humans and the environment are going to be linked forever. And the idea is not necessarily to, you know, fence people out and fence animals in. The idea is that we conserve populations by using them sustainably, so that we can continue to use them and, you know, forever, essentially.
Conservation for me is protecting the wildlife so that they can keep on performing all these natural cycles, and so that people can still use them and the government can understand how important they are just for the intrinsic value and also for these communities.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks a lot, guys. This was really cool to talk to you and kind of get an insight into you know, what your contribution is to conservation and kind of how you got there, and you know what you guys are working on and how it's all connected. You know, and I look forward to this pandemic hopefully coming to an end at some point, so everything is able to continue and all the progress that you guys are making and ACR is making is able to, you know, be in full swing. Yeah, and I hopefully get to work with you guys in the future. You know, it's just great that people like you guys exist, and I'm glad I have the opportunity to hopefully, you know, give it a voice. Brian, like you were saying, is a scientist supposed to shut up and just do his papers, or is he supposed to advocate for what he's studying also? And if there's no bridge between the research that's being done and the public eye and ear, does the research really matter if it's not reaching anybody, you know? Because we're seeing a shift in environmentally conscious thinking, but it seems to me it's just a little bit too slow, you know? So if we can keep up with it and kind of give people a way to help, because I think a lot of people want to jump on board, but they don't really know where to get started. You guys be able to give any advice to somebody who's kind of trying to break into conservation work, or anything from your own experiences that you feel like would kind of translate well?
I don't know who. Well, for me as a woman, growing up in the city, I've always, and I know this, like always you get in love with the rainforest from like watching all these documentaries or like from just taking an occasional trip. But I feel like really taking the opportunity to follow your dreams, and like I'm I'm from Peru. We are very close to our families. For a Peruvian or like a person from South America to suddenly just leave their house to go and follow their dreams to the Amazon and like protect monkeys and like work with the indigenous community, it's like a big jump. So I feel like my recommendation is like to just really like do like jump. Like it doesn't matter anything else, just like what you really want to do. Like if you really want to help all these indigenous communities, if you want to help protecting forests, let's just really take that jump. And another thing is, if we really want to have the big impact that we want to have, all these people in the regional governments or in the government from Peru, they are not going to read any article that we publish. They're for sure not going to read those. So we as a scientist, as we are developing our own projects, we have to learn how to translate our science so they can understand it. And we have to offer them with like different recommendations that they can really do. So whatever we are doing or studying has an impact in the real world, not just in the articles that we are publishing.
Cool, thanks, Fio. Very inspiring, and I'm gonna hopefully a lot of people see it. We'll make sure to post that clip by itself. All the girls out there who want to be scientists, just take the jump.
Yeah, I mean, when the parents tell you, but you're a girl, you're not supposed to do that. That's a boys' field. Or how are you gonna go to the bathroom if you're in the forest for like 4 months? Or like how are you comfortable taking a shower in just this like body of water with like metallic water somewhere there? And you're like, oh, no, that's what ladies are supposed to be doing. Or you should be aiming to have like a family, and for that you need to stick in the city and have a real life work. That's what my parents used to say, like a real life work. It's not being in but being in the city and making money every single month. And so that was a big struggle for me. I had one of those jobs until I was like, you know, father, mother, I love you very much, but I feel like I want to follow my dream. So I am moving to the forest next week, and I'm going to a volunteer job as a park ranger. So that's it. Like nobody can ever say anything else. And they were like in shock. They were like Googling all those facts of the air that I was gonna go to tell me about like all this like drug smuggling and all these like people that were murdered and like people that were murdered for like advocating and fighting all this like illegal timber extraction. And so my parents like did that a lot. But I was very sure of my decision, and I was sure that once I had jumped to make the decision, I just didn't want to go back. So it's like, okay, nothing that they tell me is gonna scare me. And yeah, after that experience, there really nothing scares me. So yeah, so.
I think my my advice, although my parents were the same.
Oh man, yeah.
Was the same. Yeah, I think my advice is that conservation can be really kind of like, it can be rewarding, but can also be very low morale, I would say, as like a career. And so my greatest advice is to think about what you're passionate about and what you're enthusiastic and curious about, because those things are going to be what you're successful in studying and advocating for. You know, for me, that's things like indigenous communities. It's things like pollution. I'm really passionate about plastic pollution. I'm passionate about biodiversity loss, things like that. And so in a field where there's always not enough funding, there's always not enough positions to go around, you know, to keep yourself motivated and to keep yourself excited about the field, you really have to be doing what you're passionate about. And so like Fio was saying, people try to tell you, oh, it's not a real job. That's not a real, you know, no, I used to get this line all the time. Nobody gets paid to run around the rainforest and look for animals. I will say that not many people get paid to run around the rainforest and look for animals. But yeah, I think that passion and enthusiasm and curiosity are the most important things. And, you know, skills are easy to learn. Like, you know, anybody can, you know, learn a language if they needed to, or learn how to do models and things like that and stuff. But if you don't have passion, you don't have curiosity, you're not going to get very far. Especially, in our field, you kind of need a graduate degree, for example. For graduate school, you need those exact same things because there are no deadlines. There's nobody breathing down your neck to, write all your stuff and get your stuff done and do your research. And, there's nobody there to hold your hand when you're in the middle of the rainforest and you have to take a bath in the river. And so unless you're really excited, you're not going to succeed. You're not going to do well.
Oh, that's really great, man. Hopefully a lot of people hear that. It's both what you guys say, I think is, it's important for someone like me to hear who's kind of getting started in this. And I think it'll really translate well to anybody who's looking to get into this field. Could you guys, as the last thing, would you guys be able to touch on fundraising a little bit? Because I know, the grant process and scholarships and stuff like that are a huge driver in being able to make certain projects possible. Brian, I know you're working with National Geographic, or at least hoping to for your next project. You able to talk on that briefly?
Yeah. So, we're both PhD candidates, so we're both really seeking our own grants at this point. And so I'll start off with, and when you're going to graduate school, for example, I'll start with this. There's a number of different sources of funding, right? So the first one would be funding from scholarships. So those are things, and these are kind of uncommon for graduate students, but merit-based scholarships, for example, for graduate school. The second type is assistantships. So if you, for instance, teach a course at a university, you usually get some funding from that. Or you could get a research assistantship, which means that a professor at a university has applied for a huge grant, say from the National Science Foundation. And in that grant, they've put in X number of dollars for a PhD student. And so they will hire you essentially and pay for your credits and pay you a small stipend as well, usually, with the stipulation that your work is on this kind of general topic that they've written a grant for. Okay, so that's a great opportunity for funding. The third is fellowships. And so those are fellowships and small grants, for example, that students apply for themselves. And that's what Fio and I have really been working on, although we both held assistantships at George Mason as well. And so, for instance, Fio as well, both of us got funding from the Fullbright Foundation, to do Fullbright from Peru to the US, and me to do Fullbright from the US to Peru. But those are things that you have to seek by yourself. And so now, as you say, now that I'm, almost done my program, I'm seeking funding to continue my studies, but as a postdoc instead of as a student. And so now I'm seeking greater grants, higher numbers, higher dollars, bigger projects that will allow me, to find some staff of my own rather than just, seeking $10,000 to continue my research in the Amazon. But I think that Fio kind of hinted on this, like communication is really important in our field. And that's communication orally, through presentations and things like that. It's communication through advocacy, so writing in plain language and translating your science to the general public, but also technical writing and communicating our research and our ideas, our hypotheses to a technical audience. And all three of those are extremely important. And as you say, in a world where fundraising and funding availability is really tight, those skills are even more valuable.
From the international student perspective here, starting my PhD, I feel like a big part that helped me in starting here, like developing my research, was getting the Fullbright scholarship. And there are different governments in like the government from your country might offer like different fellowships, but they all need you to have good scores and really a lot of experience that unfortunately we cannot get unless we are not paid or we are volunteers. So I think that to maybe come to the US or other country to study your PhD, make sure that before think good about your scores in your undergrad so you can then apply to any of those scholarships. But yeah, the Fulbright really helped me a lot here. And then small grants from from organizations that cover small parts of my research. And then the university also offers like internal funding that's really helping both of us, because I think you also got the funding right now in summer to work on our dissertation. And I haven't finished my program yet, but I am confident that I will finish it by the end of this year. So I'm already looking for opportunities for like my next step. So I guess postdoc opportunities or like maybe teaching. So really, it depends. It's out there.
Yeah, we also have, I would just add that both of us have a strong like interdisciplinary component to our work, in that there's a lot of people out there, for instance, that get their first degrees in biology, and they go get their master's degree in biology, and then they'll get their PhD in wildlife biology. And so, those people become scientists and very successful biological scientists, but they don't really consider the system as a whole as a sociocultural and biological system that they're studying. And so I think the fact that we have this interdisciplinary component to our studies, and that we have a little bit of policy, we have a little bit of science, we both do ecology, mammal behavior, we both worked in cultural studies, and used all these different techniques, and all the way up to quantitative modeling. That really makes you a suitable candidate for a lot of funding. So I guess, for people that are seeking funding, I would say don't be afraid to branch out of what, might be the norm for your program, or for your, what you think is your job, which may be studying animals. There's a lot of other facets that are important.
So, yeah, I really appreciate it, guys. I think that's great advice, and I'll be sure to, make sure as many people hear that as possible, because there's a lot of people who are hoping to get to where you guys have gotten yourselves. I think that's the biggest part of, at least what I can do to affect the future, is try and right now share your guys' stories and people like you. So I really appreciate, having the conversation. And is there anything you guys would like to say? Any last thoughts on this topic, or do you feel like you've said it all?
I don't know. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for giving us a call.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you guys, and I hopefully look forward to working with you guys in the future. Brian, good luck, man. I'm sure you'll get that doctorate.
Well, you never know with our advisors, right?
That's right. You never know.
Yeah.
Well, if all they're looking for is funny stories from the Amazon, I'm going to pass with flying colors. But I have a feeling they've got some other questions up their sleeves. So we'll see. Fio, you're going to be there, right?
Of course, I need to have all my questions prepared. Yes.
Or what Fio has up her sleeve to trip me up. We're also competitive, so that may not help me on Wednesday.
Yeah. I think Fio's secretly in your corner.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I will. Yeah. This is Brian. Yeah.
10 out of 10. Cool. All right. Well, it was great talking to you guys, and be safe, and hopefully I can link up with you guys in the future. It sounds like we're going to do a Zoom call with all of the fellows and get everyone to know each other.
That sounds cool.
Seems like a good idea. So cool. All right. Well, go ahead and sign off. I got to get off last to actually properly record this thing. So you guys are free to leave. Well, yeah. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Be safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, Fio.
Bye.